Mental Math 6, some final percentages. So we've already looked at a number of percentages. Let's review them. So we talked about finding 1% of a number. We said to do that, we move the decimal 2 places to the left. To find 2% of a number, we just find 1% of that number and double it. To find 3 or 4% of a number, we find 1% of a number and multiply it by 3 or 4. To find 5% of a number, we find 10% of that number and we cut it in half. To find 10% of a number, we move the decimal 1 place to the left. To find 20% of the number was similar to finding 2%, where we find 10% of the number and we double it. To find 30 and 40% of a number, we find 10% of that number and multiply it by 3 or 4. And to find 50% of a number, we just cut that number in half. So those were 10 different percentages that we've learned in the last 2 mental math lessons. We're going to use these percentages to help us find a few more. So our first strategy for finding other percentages is the adding it up strategy. So we can use the 10 percentages we already know to help us find others. It's just a matter of adding it up. So for example, if I wanted to know what 25% of 240 is, well, we haven't learned a strategy for 25% yet, but we know how to find 20% of a number, and we know how to find 5% of a number. So instead of talking about 25% of 240, we can do 20% of 240, and then 5% of 240 and add them together. So 20% of 240, first we find 10%, which is 24, and double it to get 48. 5% of 240, we find 10%, which is 24, and we cut it in half, which is 12. We add those numbers together, and 25% of 240 is 60. Let's look at another example. 52% of 320. So I don't yet have a strategy to find 52% of a number, but I know how to find 50% of a number by cutting it in half. And I know how to find 2% of a number by finding 1% and double it. So instead of looking for 52% of a number, I find 50% of a number plus 2% of that number. So 50% of 320, we just cut it in half, which is 160. 2% of 320, well, 1% is 3.2, so 2% would be 6.4. So I add 160 and 6.4, and I get 166.4 would be 52% of 320. So now I have a few problems I want you to try. So we're going to do the same process, but we're going to do it in parts. So we're going to start with 30% of 400. So see if you can figure that out. Okay, so 30% of 400, we start by finding 10%, which would be 40, and multiply that by 3, and 3 times 40 is 120. So 30% of 400 is 120. What about 4% of 400? So to find 4% of 400, we find 1%, which is 4, and multiply it by 4, so 4% of 400 is 16. So what if we combine those and we say 34% of 400? Well, if 30% of 400 is 120, and 4% of 400 is 16, then 34%, we just combine them to get 136. Let's try another one. 10% of 64. So remember, to find 10% of a number, you move the decimal 1 place to the left. So 10% of 64 is 6.4. 5% of 64. So remember, 5% of a number is just cutting the 10% in half, and half of 6.4 would be 3.2. So let's put them together and find 15% of 64. It would be 9.6. Okay, let's look at one more example. 20% of 130. Well, we find 10% of 130. We move the decimal one place to the left and get 13. We double it, so 20% of 130 will be 26. 2% of 130. So 1% of 130 is 1.3. We double it to get 2.6. Combine those, and 22% of 130 is 28.6. Okay, let's have a look at the next strategy. Take it away. We can also use the percentages we know to help us find others by taking it away. So for example, if I wanted to find 28% of 300. So instead of looking at 28% of 300, I'm going to look at 30% of 300 and take away 2% of 300, because 30 take away 2 gives me 28. So 30% of 300 is 90, and 2% of 300 is 6, and we subtract them, so 28% of 300 would be 84. Let's look at another example. 36% of 200. So again, I don't have the strategy to find 36%, but instead I can say I know how to find 40%, and 40 subtract 4 will give me 36. So I find 40% of 200 and subtract 4% of 200. So 40% of 200, remember we find 10%, which would be 20, and multiply that by 4. So 40% would be 80, and 4% would be 8. So 80 take away 8. 36% of 200 is 72. So let's do a few that you can try. So let's start with 20% of 500. Take a second and try that one. Okay, so to find 20% of 500, we start by finding 10% by moving that decimal one place to the left. 10% of 500 is 50, so 20% of 500 would be 100. 3% of 500, we start by finding 1%, which would be 5, and then multiply it by 3, and we get 15. So let's combine those and see if you can find 17% of 500. So since 20 take away 3 would be 17, 17% of 500 would just be 100 take away 15, which would be 85. Let's try another one. 50% of 60. So remember, to find 50% of a number, we just cut it in half. So 50% of 60 is 30. 3% of 60. So to find 3% of 60, we find 1%, which is 0.6, and we multiply it by 3. And 0.6 times 3 would be 1.8. So 47% of 60, so we would have to subtract here, because 50 take away 3 would be 47. So we would do 30 take away 1.8. Oh, and I added there. So let's fix that. My apologies. So this should actually be 28.2. My mistake. 28.2. Okay. 10% of 1,000. So 10%, you move the decimal one place to the left. So 10% of 1,000 would be 100. 2% of 1,000. So to find 2%, we start by finding 1% by moving the decimal 2 places to the left, and we get 10 times 2 would be 20. So if I wanted to find 8% of 1,000, we would do 10 take away 2 would be 8%. So we would just do 100 take away 20, which would be 80. So 8% of 1,000 is 80. Okay, and let's look at our last strategy for the day, which is putting it all together. So if we put it all together, we should be able to find any percentage of a number. So it doesn't matter which percentage I ask you, you should be able to combine those two methods to find any percentage. So for example, if I wanted to know 82% of 200, so I start by saying 100% take away 20% is going to give me 80%, and then plus 2 will give me 2%. So my recommendation to you is to always find the nearest 10. So for example, 82%, the nearest 10 would be 80%, and then either add or subtract those smaller numbers to get to where you need to be. So 82%, so we'll do, to get to the nearest 10, which is 80, we would do 100% take away 20%. And then to get up to 82, we would add 2%. So 100% of 200 is just 200. 20% of 200, so 10% is 20, so 20% would be 40. And 2% of 200, well, 1% of 200 is 2, so 2% would be 4. So we have 100% take away 20% plus 2% is 200 take away 40, which is 160, plus 4, which is 164. So 82% of 200 is 164. Let's look at another example. 57% of 400. So the closest 10 here is 60%. So we're going to start by finding 60%. So I would recommend 50 plus 10. We bring up to 60. And then how do we get to 57 from 60? We subtract 3. So we're going to do 50% of 400 plus 10% of 400 will bring us up to the closest 10, which is 60%. And then subtract 3 to get down to 57. So 50% of 400 is 200. Cut it in half. 10% of 400 is 40. Move that decimal one place to the left. And 3% of 400, we start by finding 1%, which is 4, and multiply it by 3, so 12. So we have 20 plus 40, which is 240. Take away 12 would be 228. So 57% of 400 is 228. So let's try a few. 100% of 600 is just 600. 20% of 600. Take a second and try it. So if 10% was 60, 20% of 600 would be 120. 2% of 600. So if 1% is 6, 2% would be 12. So 78% of 600. So the nearest 10 to 78 would be 80. So we could do 100% take away 20% to get to 80. And then we would take away another 2 to get to 78. So 100% take away 20% would be 600 take away 120, which would be 480. And then take away 12 would be 468. So 78% of 600 is 468. 50% of 300. So remember 50%, we just cut the number in half, so 50% would be 150. 40% of 300. So remember we find 10%, which would be 30, and multiply it by 4, 120. 2% of 300. So 1% would be 3, 2% would be 6. So if I wanted to find 92% of 300, so the nearest 10 would be 90. We find 90 by adding 50 and 40. And then to get up to 92, we add 2 more percent. So we're adding up all of these percentages. So 150 plus 120 would be 270, plus 6 would be 276. And just one more example. 50% of 700. So remember, we cut it in half, so 50% of 700 would be 350. 10% of 700. So remember, move that decimal one place to the left, and it would be 70. 1% of 700. Remember, we move that decimal 2 places to the left, so it will be 7. So let's try 59% of 700. So the closest 10 would be 60. So we would do 50 plus 10. And then we would subtract 1 to get to 59. So we would do 350 plus 70 would be 420. And then subtract 7, which would be 413. Okay? So this method is taking all of the methods we've learned right from the first mental math lesson on percentages up until today. It's putting it all together, and we can find basically any percentage of a number using these skills. So I'd like you to go online and try the Mental Math 6 quiz, which tests you on all of the different percentage skills we've learned.